Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is November 6th, 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here to, uncover the hidden psychic effects of poetry with Lucian Zell, Roy Benjamin, Patrick McGee, Duncan Eccleston, and hopefully Martin will be joining us soon. So it's pretty easy, gentlemen. I'm honored to be here with you. I think it's always a question of honoring the bardos and who has passed away in recent days. Tibetan Book of the Dead says they stick around for 3 days. So some of you might have read that great poet Gerald Stern died, poet inspired by family history and heritage. That's pretty dang good. He's 97 years old. And I thought it would be appropriate if I read just a little of one of his poems to get us started. Across the space, peopled with stars, I am, laughing while my sides ache for existence. It turns out is profound, though the profound, because of time, it turns out, is an illusion. And all of this is infinitely improbable. Given the space for which I gratefully lie in 3 feet of snow, making a shallow grave, I would have called an angel otherwise, and think of my own rapturous escape from living only as dust and dirt, little sister. What an amazing poet, Gerald Stern. And so all hail to those who've influenced and made an impact on us in the past. Jean-Luc Godard died recently, and we were lucky to have a Godard salon. And we're going to have a Werner Herzog salon, though he hasn't died yet, in January. So all these salons, we encourage you all to join in, even if you don't know anything about the subject. So back to Godard for a second. We'll go round robin with his statement. Poetry is a game of loser take all. Patrick, we'll start with you. What in the heck does that mean? And, any comment?
Well, I mean, all I can say in response to that is going to be rather personal because, I don't have any general theory, but, I recently was referring to my own work in a letter to a friend of mine, an email to a friend of mine, and I referred to it as my most extravagant failure yet. Because, I mean, to me, art that matters involves risk, and in poetry, particularly these days, because who reads poetry anymore? To be blunt, I mean, almost anything you do, even the act of being a poet. I mean, whether one is writing poetry, I mean, like Bukowski, for example, sometimes is he writing poetry or notes to himself? And it doesn't mean that I dislike it, but it just, and in my case, I don't know if I'm writing poetry. I don't even like to make that assumption because it may not be that.
Patrick, hold on. Patrick, that was perfect. Let me just jump in 2 little quick things. That's the great New Yorker article on Bukowski, who I think is an important writer, but Jesus, give me a break. So anyways, he's the most stolen book in bookstores, Bukowski. So boy, he should be proud of that for a wino whoremonger, but he is an important poet. I won't discount that. And your failure statement really resonates with Frank Zappa, who himself is an amazing rock lyrical poet, said, I'm a failure, but I'm not a miserable failure. And then we all know the Beckett fail again, failed better. So let's keep going around and things will come back around. Lucian, how do you respond to poetry is a game of loser take all?
poets are winning losers. That's something that I realized recently, and I continue to realize day by day as I go through this life. I want to throw in a couple of quotes that will also be relevant to my answer. Artie Lang, the Scottish psychologist, said that mystics and schizophrenics find themselves in the same ocean, but the mystics swim and the schizophrenics drown. And that's connected with something that obviously Allen Ginsberg experienced during his time at the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital when he spent 7 months there. And he said, the people here see more visions in one day than I do in a year. And obviously they saw the visions, but they couldn't write them. that Ginsberg could write them. And one of the things I like to note about poets notice that we notice. Everyone notices, but we notice that we notice, and then we note that we've noticed that we've noticed. And so the thing is, Jerry, obviously, we are the winning losers. We experience horrors every day because we see through the veils of smiles and frowns, and we see the core of what's seething underneath the surface. And it's a horrible thing to experience. Sometimes I feel like we're walking around like experiencing Edvard Munch's The Scream at every bus stop, you know. And at the same moment, we have to find the strength that to be the mystics and to survive, to swim in that ocean of loss and failure that's churning around us, and somehow survive, and not only survive, but thrive through creativity and note those incredible terrors that we're privy to.
Dude, that was a lot, and there was so much packed in there. I want to talk about have-tos in a while, but listen, the one thing, the Ginsberg was beautiful because that's what, when a guy went backstage after a Sun Ra concert, and, you know, he's playing all this avant-garde jazz, and the guy goes to Sun Ra, says, my kid could do that. And Sun Ra went, yeah, but can he transcribe it? Okay, so Roy, you're up. Somebody tell me this. What does loser take all? I looked it up in the dictionary and they won't even tell me what it means. They only tell me that what winner takes all. So Roy, you could probably tell me, was Jean-Luc Godard playing with the term winner take all? Or does loser take all exist in our language? And why would he say poetry is a game of loser take all? Go ahead, Roy.
Yeah, well, I mean, it reminds me of Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. It's a great villanelle that Bishop wrote. You know, I lost I lost a continent. But it's she spoke of poetry as the art of losing.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I guess that, you know, I tend to see these things in terms of the wake, where you know, he says, such is man and wife's lot of lose and win again. But he often changes that, where, you know, it doesn't seem to matter whether losing follows winning or winning follows losing, but it seems like a constant dialectic between loss and gain.
It's ever forever in flux, like a Mobius strip.
Yeah, I mean, it's like loss follows winning, and then winning follows losing. And maybe there's a Mobius strip rather than, and everything, basically everything stays the same, even though you experience it as winning and losing.
Right. Okay, that was good. Duncan, any comment?
Yeah, I'll just make a comment. You know, the old Zen story of the Zen poet in the mountains, and a robber came one night and stole from him. And the Zen poet's response was, if I could only have gotten him to steal the sight of the moon through the crack in the boards in my hut. So the point of that being that that's where the poets win. They win because I'll say I'm actually not a poet, but I have poetical tendencies at moments. We win because we see the real gold, while the other people are fighting over false gold.
Yeah.
That's what I gotta say.
No, that's beautiful. And again, it's like we're using words like I'm asking you smart friends of mine to enlighten me, which you constantly do. And I'm saying, please go to your percepts, not your concepts. But indeed, every written word is a concept in a way. It's like, I'm going to define what this is. So I think words evoke more than their meaning. So when you say concept, it's a con job. You're trying to nail something down. And believe me, conceptual art is one of my biggest influences, Marcel Duchamp. But he was sort of trying to break that what McLuhan called somnambulism, that when we invent anything, it puts us in a somnambulous state. And he talked with Pound about this, of needling the somnambulism that every invention puts us in. So we invented poetry. Humans invented poetry. We invented spoken word, printed word, and electronic word. Those pretty much are the three ways you can make poetry, materialize poetry. So the next question is, what is the function of poetry? And like Maddie busted me the other day in the Joyce. She said, you gave like 5 prompts. Usually I give about 8 or 10 prompts. I love that because she's a professional educator. It's like, I'm only supposed to give you 1 prompt, right? Like, what is the function of poetry? But I did want to jump off and say, hey, we discovered this in the Joyce, the practical function and the impractical function. You can go there. I love what Kenneth Rexroth said. He said, this nails it. We could just end it now. He said, the function of poetry is to woo your lover and subvert the bourgeois. And then Gary Snyder's is really good, but I'm going to hold off on that one. But it's sort of like what John Cage says also about music. He learned from his guru Zen guy that the function of music is to soothe the soul and make it susceptible for divine intervention. How romantic. That sounds cool. But don't you want something to irritate your soul sometime? And then you might have divine intervention as well. Who knows? Because Brecht said, the playwright who hung out right here in Pacific Palisades in LA, said, I want art that will activate me, not put me in a trance. But if I'm reading William Blake poetry and it puts me in a trance, I could eventually lead to me being activated. So we'll reverse the order. We'll start with you, Duncan. What's the function of poetry? Oh, you're on mute, Duncan.
A current function of poetry for me is to save me. And during this time of great turmoil and craziness, one of the things that I do every morning, it's pretty much the first thing I do in the morning, is go and look for photographs and poems. And I do this, I've been doing it primarily on Twitter because it's a little bit more randomized that day. But it's amazing how much stuff I can find that literally soothes my soul and girds my loin to make it through the day in a fairly happy state of mind.
Beautiful, Duncan. What's gird my loin mean? What's the
Before
verb?
going out to battle, warriors would gird their loins. Loins are the thighs. So they would tuck their skirts up and fasten them with leather cords, so their skirts wouldn't be tripping them up as they're trying to bash their enemies'
So it's
heads.
embarrassing. Battle, yeah.
That was beautiful. Yeah, when you said "save me," it really made me tear up. Thank you. Okay, Roy, what's the function of poetry, practical and impractical?
Well, I like the the idea of thinking in percepts rather than concepts, and I think in poetry it's learning how to think in images rather than statements. And actually, I still remember kind of the I didn't particularly like poetry, and I remember that it's like the first time I had a poetic experience. It was actually getting an image. It was Wallace Stevens, and the line was. Except the trace of burning stars in the frosty heavens. And I remember just suddenly just getting this image of the universe and how much darkness, how much more darkness there was than light. Like there was just tiny pin drops of light, but most of the universe was darkness. And if I'd said that, it wouldn't have had the same effect as kind of having this image of it.
And Roy, you're an educator. You work with printed matter mainly,
Mm-hmm.
and you're saying that printed matter gave you imagery in your like mind's eye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Hmm?
Yeah. Okay, Lucian, what's the function of poetry, practical and impractical?
Well, let's start with two words: soul fossils. I believe any kind of good art is a soul fossil. It basically holds the shape of a moment or an experience in a way that carries on. And so soul fossils for me extend to several realms of art that I'm exploring, including photography and music. But I'll go ahead and throw into the conversation also two answers that I've written about before. I saw you send it out to us, but I want to put it into the public record now. That poems are brainbows when the rain of feelings is pierced by the sunlight of intellect.
Hmm.
And I think that's what good poems are. They're brainbows. And there is something about the integration of feeling and thought that is so significant. It really holds something that we all need to remember and that we often forget, that maybe we know, but we have forgotten or we are neglecting. And that is that we are not just human doings. We are human beings. But if you look at the way most of us are making a living, we're actually making a dying. And that's why Bukowski is the most stolen poet, because people who are only making a dying instead of making a living, they read Bukowski and they feel that electricity of soul.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next quote, which is, poetry is like cocaine. You do it in lines, it gets you high. And if you do the good stuff, you'll be addicted for life. And I do believe that poets are purveyors of a kind of drug. And it's an interesting drug because it actually breaks your addiction to, as Duncan described it, the false gold. That's why poets are always a minority in a society, but we are a tenacious minority. And it means that even in the most oppressive regimes on the planet, poets are considered extremely dangerous. And it's because we do serve a purpose, which is to shine a light upon the soul and the core of what human beings are, and that's very threatening to larger systems. And I'll close by saying that I'm not just an artist, I'm a heartist. And ultimately, that's what poetry does. It spreads heart through a community.
Yeah. Lucian, thank you so much. That was great. Patrick, what's the function of poetry, both practical and impractical?
I don't know. This is very hard for me to respond to that because I don't like to think of it. The word functional bothers me in some way. You know, it's for me, poetry is something that you can't say any other way, or you can't find any other way to say it.
Yeah.
Poetry is has the function of saying the unsayable in a certain sense. I like some of the references that you put on in your letter about you know, the unconscious, but I don't think of the unconscious as something in my, you know, somewhere down in my brain or pituitary gland or something. It's I'm a sort of Lacanian, you know, for me, the unconscious is outside. It's the whole linguistic cultural realm, and poetry in some instances forces you to negotiate with that collective voice or multiple voice. You know, so that you are articulating a truth, but not a truth that is just your truth, but literally a collective truth through this interaction with language, with different voices. And if I can just say one little thing, it's like,
Let's go ahead.
I found rhyming for me, which is very unfashionable these days, I guess, except in songs. But rhyming for me was like a very practical tool, because what I found out was that when I was forced to rhyme, I have to rhyme. So I was forced to invent concepts or words or phrases that I wouldn't have come up with if I had no choice. And so it was a process of discovery. And I think of poetry, the function of poetry may be discovery. And of course, that could be many different things that one discovers in the process.
That was brilliant, Patrick. My wife's a songwriter, and she's constantly very rhyme oriented, and she's constantly saying being forced into rhyming can actually lead you to those breakthrough moments.
Mm-hmm.
That's, you know, that restrictive formatting causes just the opposite, the freedom. Now, what you said was brilliant, because in essence, what I'm after in all these discussions is psychoanalyzing the words I use for the prompts. You know, like the content is fine. That's what we say. But the form, how we jump off into our content, is very important to me. And I loved you challenging the word function, because that's really important to me. But Gary Snyder said it well. My task as a poet entails the work of seeing the world without language, then bringing that seeing into language. So I thought that was, you're saying the unsayable, but eventually you don't just let the thought go in your head and not say it. It's unsayable, but then you need to somehow nail it down. So go ahead, Duncan. You wanted to add something, please.
Well, I wanted to respond to that particular quote because I think it's a good quote, but it needs a little bit of expansion, because the reason for taking the unsayable and putting it into words, under the best of circumstances, is to help lead the reader back through the words to the unsayable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. And it's like, again, these words, we're elitist in a way, to me, because we're saying it leads the reader. We need to do this. We have to do that. We're driven. There's compulsion. And indeed, I always challenge that and say, well, we don't have to, but maybe we do. Go ahead, Lucian.
Just as each person has a different voice, each person has a different silence.
Yeah.
It's our voices that change as we grow older, but it's our silence that changes as we mature.
Yeah. Beautiful. That's totally yeah, the Thelonious Monk said silence is the loudest sound in the universe. And it's all that, it's all about that gap, the dynamic of what you don't say in a poem, or what you don't say in a song, or what you don't play in a musical melody or rhyme. But let's go into what Patrick brought up. And I would start with Patrick to suss out what Lacan was actually saying about consciousness is outside us, or, you know, suss that out, because here's the prompt. Lautréamont said, poetry should be made by all, not by one. Hey, high aspirations, dude. You sound like Joyce romanticizing how he made the wake. He goes, I didn't write it. Those people in the coffee house over there wrote it. Yeah, I know that. I know you sat in London you sat in Paris and listened to shortwave radio and wrote it all down, but you still were the person writing it down. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it sounds good, like, oh, it's universal. And, you know, my question in my interview with all of you is, can art making be egoless? And, you know, then one woman said, great art is egoless. And then another woman said, great art has to be egoless. so, I mean, basically, Patrick, review sort of suss out what Lacan was saying in that this outsideness and consciousness, and then any sort of response to poetry should be made by all, not by one.
Well, my own view is that, I mean, whenever one is writing anything, actually, one is always worried about a certain element of narcissism entering the picture, you know, like if you're just, you know, creating a mirror image of yourself. But my solution to that is to realize that none of us are singular. What was it? Je et l'autre, you know, Rimbaud's line, you know, I is the other.
I is the other. Very good.
And that we're all composed of others, you know, other voices, texts, phrases. I mean, things that you got from your mother, your brother, your sisters, everyone you ever met, your teachers, you know. And to me, you know, in the process of writing, you know, like when poetry gives you a kind of open framework for doing anything you want, for exploring any kind of possibility of configuration of language. And I, you know, I to me, it's something to be taken advantage of. I mean, for example, in my own writing, I'm very aware of the fact that I'm not following Mallarmé's dictum, you know, i.e., you know, I don't write with thoughts, I write with words, because for me, thoughts and words are more or less the same thing. And, you know, in my own work, thinking is what I'm doing, you know, and when I switch into this mode away from prose, there's a reason for it, but I can't exactly explain what that reason is. But in any case, as a scholar, for example, you're always aware of the fact that nobody's all that original. You know, everything, you know, arises from other voices that you contact with. You know, in America, we're obsessed with footnotes and don't feel like we can utter anything without putting a number after it. But in general, it's true everywhere. Everyone borrows from everything. And it just seems to me that poetry is a way of congealing that process, you know, where you know, you find some mechanism, some technique of getting in touch, you know, with these different voices. if I can just mention one little weird autobiographical thing, is
Please.
that my mother, who was a great inspiration to me, but she was also what they used to call in the old days intermittent schizophrenia. You know, she had these breakdowns where she would hallucinate and have visions. And several times I would talk to her and she would describe these visions to me, and they were amazing. I mean, because she was not a highly educated person, but she was very smart, and they were so utterly meaningful, but they were also kind of nutty, i.e., you know, it was not that different from reading Blake, you know, a strange juxtaposition of so many different images that you had to unravel. And I feel like when I write to this day, that my mother, who is no longer alive, is also writing through me.
Yeah.
You know, and not by herself, of course, but so I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but
Yeah.
the subject.
You're making a lot of sense, Patrick. Again, it made me tear up immensely, because that's like, who invented mental stability or mental illness? Like in the old days, your mom would have been the shaman in the village, and we all would go to her to get enlightened. And now we're going, she's nutty. Like, you know, my family's in this business or disability movement. Like, you can't say crazy or nutty anymore. You can't say those words, but you know, and we all know you can't say retard anymore. So it's like, these are just words, but
I like the word madness, Frank.
Madness. But again, you know, back to Lucian's great quote about Artie Lang, the schizophrenics are drowning. Well, maybe you know, we should be getting drowned with them. You know, but I mean, I don't want to drown and die as opposed to swim like the mystics. But at the same time, there's some value judgment going on there. But before we leave you, Patrick, that was really touching. I think you I love anecdotes. I welcome storytelling anecdotes, personal things. The original thing is great because Charlie Hayden, the great jazz bass player who played with Ornette Coleman, quotes old Joe Clark in an old Appalachian hillbilly song in the middle of a jazz song. He quotes it on his bass, and I went up to him. I says, "What's the name of that song?" He goes, "Old Joe Clark." I says, "Who wrote it?" And he goes, "Nobody wrote it," which to me is brilliant, because somebody wrote it, but it's a process of passing it down over and over, and then somebody claims the arrangement. I arranged that, so give me the intellectual property on it. So, you know, before we had printed word fucked us up. That ruined us forever. People think TV ruined us. No, printed word ruined us. But I wanted to just go back, suss out in a few words. What does Lacan mean by consciousness is outside us? Or
Well, he doesn't exactly say consciousness is outside of us. What he's saying is that the unconscious is outside of us.
Oh, unconscious.
Yeah, that we live in language, and we live in a symbolic world. I mean, I'm trying to use plain language as opposed to Lacan's very poetic language. And you know, what we're referencing when we're talking about accessing the unconscious is actually, you could argue, is culture, language, you know, things that operate on us almost like we're puppets on a string in some instances. Yeah. You know, and actually these days when you talk about the contemporary situation, Duncan, I mean, you know, we look around and we see a lot of people who look like they're puppets on a string, but then you start wondering, am I one of them? So
yeah, that's
I don't know if that made any sense, but
no, that made a lot of sense. That's Frank Zappa saying, "Watch the Nazis run your town. Now go home and check yourself. You think we're singing about somebody else." That's like that. Oh, the Nazis are running it. Okay, that was beautiful. And so, Lucian, you're up. How do you respond to this Lautréamont quote? Poetry should be made by all, not by one.
Well, I want to start by throwing in a poem of Czesław Miłosz, which I shared with my poetry discussion group last night. My discussion group's called Poetry Junkies. And the poem's called Secretaries. It's a short poem. It's only 6 lines. I am no more than a secretary of the invisible thing that is dictated to me and a few others. Secretaries mutually unknown, we walk the earth without much comprehension, beginning a phrase in the middle or ending it with a comma. And how it all looks when completed is not up to us to inquire. We won't read it anyway.
Great.
And I'll jump off of that last line because that's the thing we discussed in my Poetry Junkies group. I had read it as this fact that we don't know the context that our work is going to enter, once it's away from us. A Stradivarius, that amazing instrument, is like a boat that is floating across a sea of hands because it's played by the best musicians on the planet, but their hands, they vanish. They play all those concerts over decades and they vanish, and the boat of the Stradivarius keeps floating across this sea of hands. In the same way, a poem does that. I mean, a great poem like Shelley's Ozymandias, which itself talks about the impermanence of this great king, and the bare and level sands stretched far away at the end. But that poem itself, which is about decay and about impermanence, as I aforementioned, has floated through centuries, and it still floats, and it still impacts us, and we're still encountering it and engaging with it. But another member of our group, Dawn McGuire, a fantastic poet in her own right, she said, well, no, I saw that last line, and how it all looks when completed is not up to us to inquire. We won't read it anyway, as asserting from Miłosz's side that the poem is only half completed by the person writing it. It's fully completed by whoever is reading it, and the way that they're going to encounter and experience that poem. And I felt that, of course, Miłosz is a great Nobel Prize winning poet because he has that multivalency. My vision of it is probably a truth, and Dawn's vision of it is another great truth. And so I love both. To get more specifically as my answer to your question, I'm a traveler. I think traveling is a rehearsal for dying, because one day, just as we pack and we go to another country, well, we're going to pack and leave this earth. And, what's going to be behind us is just some psychic interconnections, the love, the hate, the hope. Hopefully we have an emphasis of positivity that we're leaving behind us. But I think it's so important to travel. And when we travel, we encounter things that we don't know we're going to encounter. As I put it in a poem of my own, hitchhiking to heaven, each love is a ride. If we'd known where we were going, we would never have arrived. So when I was traveling in Italy, I met someone who told me about Giotto. And he said, did you know that the Renaissance started with Giotto? Because he was the first person making a painting in a church who signed his name to it. This was no longer like just a craftsman making a table or somebody just making something in the church, nameless and forgotten. This was a Giotto painting of Christ. And the Renaissance began with that assertion of self. And I think that is very important to kind of throw into the conversation, that, of course, I love the comment of great art being egoless. And at the same moment, it's not personalityless. We love Jimi Hendrix because it sounds like Hendrix and nobody else. Mm-hmm. And that Hendrixness is something that could never be separated from the greatness. It's egoless in the sense that it's not like he's a petty little guy saying, look, I'm the best guitarist in the world. He's getting out of the way in an ego level. But that doesn't mean the personality of Hendrix is not shimmering and shining, and the Giotto-ness shined through Giotto centuries ago in a church in Padua, and boom, it started a revolution. So I think we have to discern between that petty little self and the larger self. I'm glad Patrick mentioned, I believe it was Patrick, Rimbaud's great quote, because I think that's one of the most significant quotes of the last couple centuries. I is somebody else, or I is the other. There is a collective self. And when you write from that collective self, you get rid of the ego. You don't get rid of the personality, but you do transcend that small self and you enter the larger. You enter that. That's why Ginsberg's poem Howl was so seminal, because he was howling for everybody. He was the howling where there is no wolves, or as Neruda said, like a barking where there is no dog. I mean, that howl was there, and he was the one to seize the howl from the invisible unconscious of Lacanian terminology and manifest it in the poem and say, I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. And I personally am starting to see the best hearts of my generation resurrected by sadness, to echo off of Ginsberg.
Yeah. I saw the best minds of my generation addicted to Zoom forever and ever. Thank God. Thank the Zoom gods. But I got to say a poem that I think it was like Homer Simpson's or somebody. Roses are red, violets are blue. I'm schizophrenic and so am I. But that was brilliant, Lucien. Thank you so much. And I mean, we got to credit you for the fact that this salon is existing, because when I interviewed you, I goes, we've got to do a poetry salon. So you are the reason we were here. But what you said was what McLuhan updated. You absorb and then you abandon. It's hard. Talked about courage and risk. Mid-career, he abandoned the medium is the message, medium is the massage, to the user is the content. And that's important to understand. That's what you were describing, sort of how the user is the content. And once you make your piece of art, it's no longer yours. Like if that secretary poem was buried in the dirt in 200 years from now, somebody finds it, there's no context there. The name who wrote it is scratched out. They just have the words. That's an amazing thing that it lasted that long. And then, you think about cave art. We have some documentation of cave art, but we don't have documentation of cave music or cave dance. So it's interesting that. So thank you so much. So Roy, you're up. Poetry should be made by all, not by one. Any comment?
Well, it actually reminds me of a George Carlin routine where he said, when I was in school, the nun said, you use your own words. And he said, I got to use the same words everybody else uses. But yeah, it definitely, what you were saying, I love that quote, I didn't write the wake. It was that woman sitting over there and that man over there. And oddly enough, Robert Burton in The Anatomy of Melancholy says something very similar. It's actually kind of, it's a Middle Age. The Middle Age is the art of cento, which means patchwork, where there was not the same sense of ownership of, and people could freely borrow from other people without quoting them, and there were no copyright laws, and there wasn't that same sense of ownership, which in some ways is a very restricting economic force, I think, against poetry. But I do know that in the it reminded me somehow of the Emerson's essay on Shakespeare. He talks about the early Shakespeare and the number of lines that he actually just took from other people. And he would Robert Greene called him an upstart crow beautified in our feathers. You know,
Wait, say those. So he calling Shakespeare what? Say those
an
again.
upstart crow beautified in our feathers. He's just stealing from everybody, and you know, there's not any originality, and maybe that was his greatness. You know, that he didn't have that sense of ego originality, but he was almost like a corporation in himself. But one last thing, I don't know if Patrick, you know the poem "For Once Then Something" by Robert Frost. It's a great little poem, but it's about him looking in the water and seeing his reflection and worrying about whether what he's doing is just narcissism. And then for a second he sees through the water into like something at the bottom, but then immediately it goes away. But he says, was that the truth, or was that a pebble of quartz? But then he said, well, for once then something, at least it wasn't just me.
Beautiful. That's Roy. That's so important because one of McLuhan's most important essays is Narcissism as Narcosis. It's a different interpretation of narcissism. Beautiful. What you brought up was just yesterday, intriguing new pop star from California, Olivia Rodrigo, has been known to have pretty much ripped off other people like twice already. And now her new song is a ripoff of Elvis Costello. And he goes, that's what rock and roll's all about. I don't care. All the power to her. And it was like so refreshing to hear, like, where's my money? You ripped me off. It's like, dude, I've ripped everybody off my whole career. Go ahead, Lucian.
Just want to throw in a Godard quote, since you already inserted one. He said, it's not where you take things from, it's where you take things to that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Things from you take them to. Yeah. Really good. Okay. That was really important what you said, Roy, too, about ownership, because when Giotto invented signing art, we're fucked from that point on. Like, I own this. It's like, no, that's like going to the 99-cent store and buying a bottle of water and a bag of dirt. Who said that this person owns water and who says they own dirt? Like, come on, can't you have these two things like free and everything else? No, we sell everything. We own that water. But this thing, the word you said was patchwork. The sense of ownership.
Yeah.
Like, what? That's amazing. That was really good. Okay, Duncan, for the final benediction on Lautréamont, any comment? Poetry should be made by all, not by one.
Poetry is made by all. No, seriously, it's made by all. A poet does not, a person formally designated as a poet does not exist in a vacuum. He uses languages that have been invented by others over periods of hundreds or thousands of years. He's taking experiences that he sees, which are largely produced by other people. And then, of course, the work itself is interpreted by whoever is reading it and whatever their perspective and their needs are. So, and going back to Giotto, I think that if you studied the history, you will find that he probably signed his painting, one, because at least the historians give him credit of actually developing a new style of painting, a type of perspective. And two, he was embedded in Florence, which was a very commercial town. It was a very much of a banking and commercial town. And what we're really fighting over much of the time, when poets want credit, or songwriters want credit, or painters want credit, we're arguing about who gets the money. How's the money going to be divided up? if we were in a culture where everybody had, I mean, most people are struggling for money only because it's hard to get enough money just for basic living. I'm convinced that the majority of people would be very content not to be in that struggle at all if they just had a modest, fundamental amount of energy called money to go about their living. They wouldn't want credit for what they did necessarily. They wouldn't be out there struggling. We wouldn't have our legal system totally obsessed with ownership and how things get divided up. That's a long way to come back to, yes, poetry is everybody. A poet is lucky that they get to be a pivot point. But they're exactly that. They're a pivot point.
Good. Really good word, pivot point. Yeah, I'm gonna send my comment that printed word fucked us up. Money fucked us up. Money ruined humans.
Money changes everything.
Yeah, but I do revert back to Zappa again. He says, I'm a devout capitalist. Okay. I'll give you the line from Sponto Gallery, which was the home birthplace of the Beats in Venice, California, when it was called Venice West. We were lucky enough to put on events there for many years. And one of our mantras was, how much am I not paying you? Double that. Okay, so, this whole perspective thing was really enlightening. Lucian, thank you for bringing that up, and Duncan going off on it, because that's like, I think one of the most bullshitty things McLuhan says, but I think it sort of resonates, that when humans invented the vanishing point in painting, so is that perspective, that's when humans started having a point of view. The vanishing point made us have a point of view, like this poet's good and that poet's not good. So we have a point of view. And McLuhan eventually said, understanding is not having a point of view. It's like, well, I think this poet's good and that poet's not good. That's a point of view. But if you want to understand, you try to get the big picture view. So here's what I find important to do when throwing out cute quotes all the time is, it's not that so much how the quote enlightens you or causes you to think or you have an epiphany. It is, how are you going to reword that quote? How are you going to take it farther? And so a good example was with Robert Browning's line, our reach should exceed our grasp, or what is heaven for? And McLuhan said, our reach should exceed our grasp, or what is a metaphor? Roy, I'm glad you laughed. You liked it. It's like the one guy in the Lenny Bruce concert, we laughs in the corner and everybody else is like, what? So this is
your own laugh track, I think.
Yeah, I need a laugh track. But this is, how and why do you use metaphor? It's a stupid question. Again, rather than, like Patrick said, what is the function of metaphor? Give me a break. That's, McLuhan said, all words are metaphoric. So this question is, how and why do you use metaphor? Or tell me a better question about metaphor. And just to set it up in honor of Maddie and 5 more prompts. A metaphor like transports, or does it transcend, or does it transform, or does it transmission? Like there's some trans in metaphor. It's something between the two. Like Jean Rouch, the French documentarian, says, if I put a camera between me and you, it's more true than if there's no camera between us. And most people would say that's stupid. That's not true. So that's what do we put between us as a metaphor? It's transference, maybe. And so this word transference brings up Philip Larkin saying poetry should begin with emotion in the poet and end with the same emotion in the reader. Again, there's the should word. The poem is simply an instrument of transference. So we'll start with you, Roy. What in the heck is metaphor? How and why do you use it? Or how could I ask this question better?
Well, I know that Shelley in his essay on famous essay, but he talks about metaphors. They all inevitably turn into dead metaphors because they're overused, and then you forget that they're metaphorical, and they just become completely literal. And he says, it's the job of the poet to kind of reinvigorate the metaphors by reestablishing the original relationship that created the metaphor to begin with. And one of my favorite examples, like Shelley's "To the Moon," art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth, where he starts out with the image. He notices that the moon is a pale color, but then he starts to metaphorize, turning it into a person, or kind of projecting his own sense of weariness and loneliness onto the moon, where the moon becomes a living thing, but in a way his animated stand-in for Shelley himself, sense of loneliness and wandering companionless. But I think
that's good, Roy. Yeah, I think Shelley got it from Jackie Gleason when he had that TV show, To the Moon. Yeah, it's called reverse presaging. Someday Jackie will be using my metaphor. So let's give it to him credit, and then people will learn Shelley. Okay, Duncan, you're up. How and why do you use metaphor, or how in the heck could I ask this question better about metaphor?
We use metaphor because there's only so many primary experiences that are easy to perceive. And then I'll go to the Chinese characters for this one. They have very fundamental characters like woman. They have fundamental characters like heart, because they know what a heart is. And then you get a more metaphorical character to describe anger. And anger is the heart of a woman being pressed down by a large hand. So, this is why there's metaphor. I mean, metaphor is very useful. The problem is we are not these days by nature meditative creatures. So metaphors get out of hand. And we start forgetting that we've created these things to help us express, going back to Gary Snyder, the unexpressible.
Yeah.
That which resides only clearly in silence. So.
Beautiful, Duncan. That's James Joyce, where the hand of man never set foot. That's a good way to convince people that Finnegan's Wake is worth reading. They're like, that's funny. That sounds like Laugh-In. And most people don't even know what Laugh-In is. Okay, Patrick, you're a writer. How and why do you use metaphor, or how could I ask this question better? Since you brought up that word function, that's like when I asked this woman, is are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings? She goes, the word more doesn't function in your question. I says, that is the best answer I ever had. That word doesn't function in your question. Okay, Patrick, go ahead.
Boy, I don't know. I don't feel like I use metaphor a lot in my own writing, and then I don't know if I do in my thinking. And then I think about it a minute, and I realize that I do, because, for example, a big word for me is monster, because I actually wrote a memoir, kind of a memoir, where the title was monster, had to do with, use the word. Actually, the title was King Kong in Memphis, but but the subtitle was My Life as a Monster. And monstrosity is sort of a key term for me, because it embodies this force that that can't be tamed in a person, and it can be good or bad. I mean, monstrosity can be something evil, or it can be something good. To me, metaphor language is inherently metaphorical, because if I can use probably a weird comparison, it's like if you take the concept of criticism, which I have written a lot of. And one of the things I would sometimes try to explain to my students is that you can't be completely polyphonic all the time. At some point, you have to make a decision. But you need to make a decision in such a way that the reader is aware of the fact that that is a point of connection, like if you're reading a text and you reach a conclusion, and that conclusion is kind of like a metaphor, because it's sort of a closure. It shuts down the process, the stream of language, so to speak. And too often in the past, when people would do that, they would actually be serious. Like, now I've come up with the final reading or the final interpretation or the final meaning. These days, I think most people are aware of the fact that that's pointless, that each closure is a stopping point to begin again. And that would be, I think, how I would see metaphorical language or figurative language, is that it's a way of conveying something, concretely, perhaps, like if you're dealing with something that's kind of abstract or ephemeral or difficult to express, the metaphor can give it a sense of closure. But luckily, because it is metaphor, the reader knows that it doesn't entirely work. They're aware of the fact that metaphors always fail to some extent, in the same way that analogies fail.
Yeah.
And as a teacher, I was kind of well known for using a lot of anecdotes, because I was often teaching critical theory to undergraduates, which is actually something I enjoyed doing. And because it was so difficult for them. And I would tell stories to try and get ideas across. And that's perhaps not quite the same thing as metaphor, but it's moving from something that's abstract or unsayable, if you will, into something that gets it a little more concrete, but at the same time, it doesn't delude you with dogma. It doesn't give you that illusion of, closure, complete closure. It's just another opening. I don't know. Again, I feel like I'm not making sense half the time.
Oh, dude, Patrick, you're brilliant. We love you being here. It's a lot, because one is you evoke T.S. Eliot. In my end is my beginning. Or I probably misremembered it wrong. It's in my beginning was my end. And so that's the beauty, is I don't even know how the fucking cliche goes, but I know it has the word beginning and end in it. Which one is it? In my end is my beginning, or in my beginning is my end?
End is my beginning, I think.
In my end is my beginning. That's what my wife said to me every night.
It's the four quartets, right?
Yeah. But it is fun, because what it is we're self-brainwashing ourselves to go, oh, I'm concluding my essay now. And then, we're hoping that when the reader reads that, they will go away from the essay and continue to think. and maybe be stimulated to have more rather than feeling comfortable. I know what the writer said, and I'm going to, feel confident with knowing that concept instead of like it giving birth to more. So I love the word monster and all that. So Lucian, you're up. What the heck is the question? How and why do you use metaphor, and how could I ask that better?
So I'm 20 years old. I'm hitchhiking through Greece, and I start to see trucks with the word metaphora printed on them. And I'm thinking, God damn it, these Greeks are so poetic. Not only do they have all this great mythology and this fantastic literature of the Odyssey, etc., but now they're just this, metaphora going by on these trucks. And I talk to somebody and they start laughing when I mention it. And they say, well, metaphora just means transport. It's a transport company.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's all that a metaphor really is. It's transporting something. I'm going to jump to a few things quickly. So first of all, I've got a quote that I actually break in with another quote from it's a quote from Emily Dickinson. So I really like that Robert Rauschenberg suggested that montage is the 20th century's greatest invention. So this is a montage of two quotes. And the first quote that I'm embedding the other quote into is from a book called Madness, Rack, and Honey by Mary Ruefle. Metaphor is not and never has been a mere literary term. It is an event. A poem must rival a physical experience. And here comes my interjection of Emily Dickinson. If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? And metaphor is simply an exchange of energy between two things.
That's good.
It's really good.
Thank you. I think you're right. It's brilliant. That's why I'm quoting her and not myself. Two beautiful women I've meshed together. And I didn't even realize when I was writing this particular montage that, Emily Dickinson reaches for metaphor in order to describe the experience that she's having. Why does she do that? Because it's the best way to describe it. You can't put it into any other words than to say that, that no fire, so cold, no fire can ever warm me. Well, she has to reach for metaphor because it's the only way to articulate that particular crazy inner experience that she's having. And, whether you should ask the question differently, yes, because you should ask it in a metaphorical way. But, I want to say that one of the greatest, I believe, practitioners of metaphor in the 20th century, at least, is Pablo Neruda. And he finishes, his life with the Book of Questions. And that's a great way for a poet to end. We should not conclude our lives with a book of answers, but a book of questions. So one of the questions in the book is the rose naked or is that her only dress?
Wow.
And it's such a beautiful metaphor. It's just such a beautiful mix of metaphor and personification. And, it uses so much and it does it as Tom Lux insisted that poets must do. Poets do more with less. And there is no way of doing more with less than metaphor.
Yeah. Brilliant. Go ahead, Duncan. Thank you, Lucian. You got to unmute Duncan.
A couple of things. Metaphor only really works when it's fresh and shocks the mind. And the proof of that, this is an argument that Jerry and I have back and forth, is advertising. If an advertising agency gets a metaphor that they like and they work it to death in 1,000 different ways, it literally goes to sleep in everybody's mind. It loses its potency. And it's pure because we are lulled. Oh, yes, oh, well, I've heard that 999 times. I don't need to pay any attention. So, for Jerry Fialka, who wants to know about his question, have you ever taken all the answers to that particular question and collected them in one basket and looked at them?
Yeah, that's a good question, Duncan. I wouldn't want to ruin it with an answer, but I will. That's quoting John Cage. I've dropped that question from my interview for about 20 years, the metaphor question. It's too sort of mamby-pamby. How and why do you use metaphor? And then people go, well, I use it. I should bring it back, but I dropped it. But most, when I say to someone, are humans more feeling or thinking beings? They will say 80% of people will say feeling. And then I'll repeat that. Well, 80% of people say feeling. So I do what you're saying. I do sort of keep a little Rolodex in my mind of how people answer a certain question. And then I give this 50 to 80% answer it this way. You're unique. You answered it like, the other way.
I'm going to say that I would be very interested to know if what you have in your mind actually matches the reality.
That's exactly what I'm trying to say, because I'm fishing for answers. When I hear, it's pretty accurate, but of course it's got a major bias happening because I'm the one collecting it in my head, and right now I'm definitely suffering from dementia and forgetting things, and so I can misremember things really bad these days. But I want to tell Lucian how I love the story of the trucks, because I have a similar story. I'm from Flint, Michigan, where we knew the water was polluted before Rachel Carson's book came out in '62 called what's it called?
Silent Spring.
Silent Spring. What an amazing word, a book, because she brought up to our attention this word pollution, or that's 1962. Before 1962, we all knew you don't go near the Flint River. Then fast forward 50 years later, they're serving Flint River water to people in the jails in Flint, because that's the only people they can legitimately give the water to, because it's killing all the regular people in Flint. So if you sell a house with water that's contaminated, you can go to jail. So you sell your house in Flint, Michigan, you're in jail, and they go, here's your water. I didn't contaminate my water, you did. So I'm driving through Flint a couple years ago, and on the side of a truck it says Flint Water Company, or the Department of Government. How could you even work for a governmental company that says Flint Water on the side of it? Aren't you well, I don't drink this stuff, I just tighten the pipes up or something. Yeah, go ahead, Roy.
No, I was just going to say Death Incorporated.
Yeah, Death Incorporated. It's like it really is like Frank Zappa said, the ocean is the ultimate solution. So I've sort of dominated this. I hope you guys feel free to come up with any question or comments, but I'd love to go here for a second. This guy's another hero of mine who died. Peter Sheldall. You probably read him if you read art criticism in the New Yorker, but look at his obit. Art critic with poet's flair. Like what, what do you want? What do you want the New York Times to say in your cut line? So I mean that would be pretty nice, wouldn't it be? New York art critic with poet's flair. And so, really a great writer. And he wrote with undiminished enthusiasm for more than a half a century, with fewer could rival his sheer eloquence. He was a poet on a vocation and got lucky and got a job doing art criticism, and then he could be poetically, flairful. He said Dadaism was an ancestral vein of cool. Those who wondered what it meant could never know. I mean, that line is amazing to me. Like, those who wondered what it meant could never know. So I'm heavily influenced by Dada and Surrealism. I wonder what it meant, but why am I trying to figure out what it meant if I'm never going to know? So it's sort of like, where do we go from here back to Leo Bersani's Mallarmé study? And we'll go round robin with this quote. The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. So Duncan, we'll start with you. I've loved this quote because I think you could substitute anything in there, any sort of art making. But what do you think, Duncan? You're on mute. The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. And I know crises is a little radical and threaten is a little radical. So you can approach it however you want, but I'm curious your thoughts, Duncan.
I don't know what he's talking about. What
Very. Well, we'll go round robin. I'll respond to yours. But go ahead, Roy. Any comment?
Could you say it one more time?
The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I want to connect that to what I think Lucian was talking about, drowning, or the idea of the
swimming, swimming
versus drowning, which is actually very similar to what Carl Jung thing I said about Lucia Joyce and James Joyce. That one is swimming and the other is drowning.
That's it. Yeah.
But I mean, it seems like to take Shelley's as an example again. A lot of his poems, like from the Laughtears throughout Aeneas, they do have this not just fascination with drowning, but it seems like a real true death wish of wanting to drown and wanting that consummation, so that something else would spring out of it, that he's willing to sacrifice himself. And he did manage to do that in his life. He drowned.
Literally drowned, right?
You mean Shelley literally drowned?
Literally drowned. In fact, he was out in a boat in a storm, and they wanted to come save him, and there were two of them. They waved them away. No, we want to be in the storm with our boat. We almost, we want to force the moment, force the moment to its crisis, as Eliot says. Without tea and cakes and ices. Wow. That's my wife thought we were going to have tea because it was a salon here.
What kind of tea, Roy? Well,
Yeah,
that's that's what I always say. You don't have to read 22 McLuhan books. You can just read the intro to his first book. And he says that we're swimming in sensory overload, information overload, just like Poe's sailor in Descent into the Maelstrom, the short story. And he just studies the patterns of the broken up boat in the whirlpool. And instead of going swooshing down to his death and being drowned, he uses the broken boat parts to swoosh his way out of the whirlpool. So that's what he says. We can use the same techniques of advertising, which is symbolist poetry, and effects precede causes, and swoosh our way out of sensory overload. So that's funny that Shelley was like, "Hey, don't. We're drowning on purpose here." Go ahead, Duncan.
Well, as you know, I'm not a big fan of most of the romantics. That they are a distortion of the Bakhtian carnivalesque, where they took the humor and the joy of the carnival and made it deadly serious. And so, that's just setting yourself up for disaster, which the romantic poets did over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Shelley's just one example. Lord Byron is another.
He had a great sense of humor, though. He was.
Huh?
Don Juan. God, that's hilarious. That's some of the funniest rhymes ever.
Yeah, but he's also
he
a guy
said,
that knowingly ran around giving venereal disease to all sorts of lovers.
You're gonna,
Not
personal life,
exactly.
not his poetry.
Can you separate the art from his sexual diseases?
Intertransference, yeah.
Intertransference. Okay, Duncan, that was a very good point. But are you done? Or you want to? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, I think I interfered. I jumped in on that one, so I think.
No, that's all right. We want interference. So, anyways, Patrick, you're up. The very crisis which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. Any comment?
Well, I think that there's a kind of self-evident truth to that, in the sense that the history of poetry is the history of trying to break out of one mode of expression. It's going from the Romantics to the Victorians, so forth and so on. Once in a while, you get somebody like Blake who doesn't fit anywhere, which is one reason why I love Blake so much. But I think today, for example, what is called contemporary poetry has gotten to be, its very innovations have almost become repetitive, and which means that there's an opportunity to try and do something else, and I don't necessarily mean that as like a put down of a whole line of poems or poets or anything like that. I just think that like I'm writing a poem called Comedy, and I read I was reading I can't think of the guy's name. He wrote Divine Comedies. It's I'm thinking Charles Wright, maybe. I'm not sure. I can't remember. I'm terrible about names these days. But I was reading it, and I mean, I was envious of the man's facility with language. You know what I mean? But at the same time, it was so hermetic and so closed in, and I knew that I did not want to write this way. For one reason, because I can't. I actually can't write this way. And for another reason, one reason why I can't is because I'm trying to do, something else. So I think I think not just poetry, probably all literature, but poetry maybe in particular, there is always a continuing crisis, in the sense that, you generate these so-called trends, and you can't escape them. You know, if you write something that doesn't fit in, somebody's going to point it out, inevitably. And every writer is aware of this, just like every scholar is aware of, what preceded whatever they're writing and how they're going to fit into that, and to the point where it becomes this silly game of every preface claiming I've made a major discovery that changes everything, when in fact you read it and it changes almost nothing. It may have some interest, but
Yeah.
So I think there is a truth to that, but it's kind of a banal truth in a way. It doesn't really, to my mind, get to the essence of poetry or literature.
Good, Patrick, because that was your word self-evident, phrase self-evident truth was evoking for me. Schopenhauer said, all truth passes through 3 stages. 1, it's ridiculed. 2, it's violently opposed. 3, it's accepted as being self-evident. Oh, I knew that all along. And my mantra is Louis Buñuel's, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. So I do love you saying this, that this statement is self-evident, because it's just the words crises and threatens. But when you sit down to make a film, paint a painting, write a poem, that's what's sustaining your composition. You're actually sitting down to do it. In other words, if you read that New Yorker article on Bukowski that convinced me he is important, he just goes, I don't write poems. They just happen. It's just my life. I'm just scribbling shit down. And then this guy came to me and said, dude, I can publish this. And that's, if you know the history of Bukowski in all the movies, I've watched them all and know people who've been his lovers and all that, they all say he really wasn't that great of a poet to have that many books. But because he got momentum and started selling, that it didn't matter what you put out, that people would buy it. Because, it's another Bukowski thing. So all the power to him, That's People magazine had an article about Bukowski years ago. Their neighbor, the neighbor of Bukowski in San Pedro, after he was a drunk and all this, horror and all that, he's sort of a known poet now. His neighbor says, why in the fuck is Madonna and Sean Penn coming over to this guy's house? He's a fucking wino drunk, Like, what the heck? How did that happen?
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. The French philosopher Alain Badiou uses the French word, I'm probably not pronouncing it well, but déchet, which means waste, and he talks about how great works of art will come along, that do something shocking or profound or whatever, capture people's attention. But then over time, they can become waste because they get, sort of like they go to the museum. We don't usually think of works of art in a museum as waste, but he means waste in the sense that they get fixed in some way. People have got, but the thing is too, is that as a teacher, teaching Joyce, which I know you're interested in, it always seemed to me that the thing you had to do was to make Joyce, for example, get away from, break down the canonical image that surrounded him, make it raw and challenge things. I mean, so instead of saying, okay, let's read Homer and then see what Joyce did, I would frequently say, forget Homer. There's almost very little of Homer in this book when you really get down to it, and start making it strange. And I think that that's what poetry, this linguistic thing you're talking about, is that the poets continually have to say, well, wait a minute. All these language poets have already done this. The romantics have already done that. I mean, I've got something I want to say, here. There's something I want to get out. And, you're struggling to find it, in a different mode.
Yeah, that was good. Roy's up and then Duncan. But let me just interject quickly. That's like what you said, Patrick, is when that woman put Marcel Duchamp's toilet as a piece of art and covered it in gold. Oh, now it's gold. Now it's a gold toilet. Go ahead, Roy, and then Duncan.
No, I was just going to say, it just reminded me that there's a story I like about Joyce where the guy said, "Can I kiss the hand that made me lick these?" No, it did a lot of other things too.
That's W.C. Fields. Don't drink water, fish fuck in it. Okay, Duncan, you're on mute. So what do you got?
Okay, so coming back, okay, now that I've heard everybody else's answers, the crisis, I know what crisis you're talking about, generally speaking. And I think it's most easily understood by framing it as the crisis in songs and music. Because, it's obvious on the face of it that if you look at pop songs, they're fresh, they're lively, everybody's excited about them, and oh my God, did you hear rah rah? And everybody's excited, and then after 6 months, 2 years, everybody's like, that's passé. Oh my God, and then waiting for some new type of lyric, something, and it all has to do with, does it wake you up? Does it get you excited?
Yeah.
Does it do something to you? And when words and patterns of words put us to sleep, when we don't want them to put us to sleep, that's the crisis.
Very good, Duncan. And Lucian, you're up to comment on it, but I want to thank you for quoting or bringing up Jimi Hendrix, because that's why I like Cornel West, because whenever he's talking, he goes, like my brother Bootsy Collins and Bessie Smith say, I want to reference black music in all my salons. And when you reference Jimmy, there's nothing more poetic than this line. Most people don't realize Jimi Hendrix was a great lyricist because it's overdone by his guitar playing. Listen to this line. I can hear happiness. That's fucking as good as Neruda, right? I mean, that's amazing. I can hear happiness. That's pretty simple. One line. He wrote some amazing. Is it love or confusion? I mean, I could go on and on, but thank you, Lucian, for bringing up Jimmy in a poetry salon. And what's your take on this line? The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Well, I'll go ahead and take it just a different direction than anyone yet has taken it, and talk about the crisis of the poet, him or herself. Because one of the things that I wrote years back is your real work is not what gives you your food, it's what gives you your hunger. And I mean that even though I'm going through my own period, as I call it, these are my Van Gogh years. And in my Van Gogh years, I don't want work that only gives me my hunger. I mean, I can't survive and raise my family unless I have food that gives me food and hunger and food.
Yeah.
But I do think that the role of the poet is to be that person at the edge, because that's where the views are. And that's why those people of the 27 Club, of which Hendrix is a member, hell, we just got Janis Joplin. These people had to stand at the edge in order to get such profound views. And I want to throw in Socrates from Phaedrus. But if any man comes to the gates of poetry without the madness of the muses, persuaded that skill alone will make him a good poet, then shall he and his works of sanity with him be brought to naught by the poetry of madness. And behold, their place is nowhere to be found. So I would suggest that the crisis is that the true poets have to really be edgy people. They have to be those people really perched at the edge. and the edge is slippery, and you just can slip off. And you know, and at the same moment, that dangerous position that creativity calls us to, that it summons us to, is the place from which we do create the best work.
Yeah.
And my heart has been broken hundreds of times, and that's a modest statement. And yet, I still believe the heart breaks to get bigger, or it can break to get bigger.
Yeah.
And that's what we're called to do when we face that crisis. And I'll also jump to the Chinese, because they have the same word for crisis and opportunity. So the crisis is an opportunity, but it's not an easy opportunity. And I'll close my answer with one anecdote about two poets, father and son, James Wright and Franz Wright. They're the only father and son combination in poetry that both got the Pulitzer Prize. But Franz had been estranged from his father, James. They actually didn't really spend much time together when Franz was growing up. And Franz decided to send his father, James, a sheaf of poems. And he sent the poems, and James wrote back to Franz. He said, "I'll be damned, son. You're a poet. Welcome to hell." So that's the crisis that I would like to point outline, the necessary crisis of vulnerability and, let's face it, borderline madness that a true poet has to sustain.
Beautiful, Lucian. My dear friend Mike Sakamoto is heavily involved with many hours of making a film with me right now, like many hours. And he just recently turned me on to James Wright and Franz and has taught me a lot. And James Wright's brother married a woman who used to bring one of the women to our group, to our McLuhan discussion group. So Liz Wright used to come to our discussion group, and she was sort of thought McLuhan was full of bullshit. And I was like, man, you're the most important person in this meeting. Yes, I'm glad you're here. I mean, she didn't use the word bullshit, but she was. But that's also brings up that joke where the guy gets to the gates of hell, and he's standing there and he's peeking in, and he can see that they have poetry salons on Zoom in hell. And he goes, "You have Zoom with poetry salons in hell?" And the devil goes, "That's all we have." Let's do talk about hell. Let's do a tetrad. So this is 4 questions that McLuhan and his son came up with. They called it a cross between hieroglyphics and poetry. So we're going to take a term, a word that's invented by humans. It's called rhyme. We invented rhyme. Okay. And we're going to psychoanalyze the hidden psychic effects of rhyme, not why rhyme was invented, not the intention of the invention, but the hidden psychic effects of how it's shaped our behavior. So it's more so the environment that has been caused by rhyme, rather than the word rhyme and the actual thing that rhyme is. So, Roy, we'll start with you. The first question is, what does rhyme enhance or intensify? And again, this is totally first thought, best thought off the top of your head. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to be witty. It's just sort of your hunch. Your hunch. Yeah. Go ahead, Roy.
Was that a purpose? Was that a purposeful rhyme? Or you said the intention of its invention, or was that?
That was not that is not a purposeful rhyme. That is funny that I say that. But what does rhyme in? Well, you could say a question, a stupid question like that you said, Jerry. No, what does rhyme enhance or intensify?
Well, I think it draws connection between things that might be that are different or might seem to have no connection, but just the fact that they rhyme does seem to establish some sort of connection. I think that in itself is probably an incentive to try to find these connections that are not so obvious in order to make the rhyme make sense.
Yeah.
So,
Very good. Okay, Lucian, what does rhyme enhance or intensify?
The ghost of electricity howls in the bones of her face, and these visions of Johanna have now taken my place. You know, when Dylan uses rhyme, and I think Dylan is the master of rhyme in the 20th century, entering the 21st now too, still going. I mean, yeah, I totally agree with Roy. It draws connection. It also does something which, you know, I believe it was W.H. Auden ultimately said, you know, regarding what poetry is. If it's anything, it's memorable language. So rhyme certainly enhances memorability. You know, that's I believe the source and the root of rhyme with the original poets is that they had an oral tradition. They couldn't write these damn things down. I remember being at a party with an Irish poet. I don't even remember her name, but she was relatively renowned. But at the cocktail party following the reading that she gave, I overheard her say, "Yeah, I'm just a minor poet. You know, I'm not a major poet. I'm a minor." And I leaned over and I said, "Listen, are you being facetious? I mean, it's rare for a poet to say something like that they are a minor." She said, "Oh, no, I'm not being facetious at all." She said in Ireland, the bards, you know, they would enter a dark cave and they would not come out until they had the poem.
Nice.
Write it in the darkness. And of course, you need rhyme in order to remember. Certainly a lengthy piece of writing will be helped by rhyme. And when she said that, I realized that there are a few poems I've written, which I wrote without pen, without paper, without computer, obviously, just in my head, in that dark cave. And actually, not all those poems rhyme. But I'll bring in another suggestion to our conversation, and that is that poems always rhyme, but they don't necessarily rhyme with words. They rhyme with concepts. They rhyme some other ways besides the obvious rhyme. And then, of course, there is internal rhyme and other uses of rhyme and chime that affect us. Since we brought up James Wright and you're interested in him, Jerry, there's a fantastic poem of James Wright called Hook. And the last line of the poem, in which he's describing having met a man at a very frozen bus station who has a hook and who gives him this change. He actually takes 65 cents and gives it to him with the hook and passes the change to him. And the last lines in the final stanza, he says, you know, I took it. It wasn't the money that I needed, but I took it. And it was in my Poetry Junkies session last night that one of the poets, Susie, said, you know, that last word that's repeated twice, took, it rhymes with the title, Hook.
Nice.
It's not an obvious rhyme. It's a very unobvious rhyme. I would never have gotten that in a 1,000 years. And that's another reason that I would suggest that people do read poetry aloud with others. Is that you can find things you would never have noticed. You know, you need that group collective consciousness to approach it. So those are my 2 cents for now.
Yeah, that's why Joyce required you to read the Wake out loud with other people. But a lot you brought up, Lucian. And the deal with Tetrad is you keep your answer to 3 to 5 words. But of course, you guys are all so poetic. You can ramble on forever. It's all good. And it's also not the obvious. We're going for the deep sea diving, like little The obvious is fine, but we're trying to get a little deeper. But three things. James Joyce was asked at Rolling Stone magazine in an interview, why did you write the lyric, I'm reading James Joyce? And he goes, because it rhymed with the other line. He didn't say, that is a great smart ass answer for Dylan. He didn't say because I'm actually am reading James Joyce, it's because it rhymed. And then they said, are you a poet? And he goes, no, I'm a trapeze artist. But staying in the rock realm, yeah, you got to go in a cave when you're an Irish bard. Now all you got to do is be Bono and fucking try to be a Ramones wannabe band, and then you'll become arena rock. Give me a fucking break. When there's Shane McGowan, who he sits, is truly an Irish poet, the lead singer of the Pogues. And, he did go into the dark cave of fucking alcohol. He's like lives there. If you haven't seen Crock of Gold, the documentary on Shane, you've got to see it. It is truly a great doc on a great poet who would never say he was a poet,
What's it called again?
Crock of Gold. I
Gold.
think isn't Crock of Gold from Joyce, or it's some Irish.
James Steffens' book.
James Steffens' book, yeah. Okay, so Patrick and then Duncan. What does rhyme enhance, Patrick?
I don't know. I think I really look at it more pragmatically. I mean, you could argue that it creates a rhythm, it creates a backbeat, it does all kinds of things. But when I was reading Dante, and I was sort of going back and forth between translations and the Italian, and I was looking at the way he was rhyming, and what interested me was that, and it's okay to disagree with what I'm about to say. I'm just giving you my impression, but I was suddenly struck by the fact that Dante isn't poetic all the time. I.e., he has a narrative he's engaged in. He has a worldview that's pre-established for him, and then he'll come up with these great lines, periodically that he achieves. But the rhyming keeps it going together. But the thing is that what I really was looking at was repetition. Like, how often does he repeat the same line? Of course, he repeats the same rhyme rather frequently. In fact, more than one would imagine. Because in Italian, you've got so many vowel endings that it's, I wouldn't say easy, but, and it's more complex than that. He's frequently rhyming the whole word, but it's a different kind of musicality from English. So when I started rhyming, to be honest, I mean, like I was saying earlier, a lot of my word choices were simply based on the fact that I'm looking for some word that will rhyme. And then when I do that, I'm trying to shape a concept out of it or something out of it. And there's that decision again and again. What I realized too was that I could not possibly do Terza Rima. Forget it. I mean, Shelley, I think, came the closest to doing Terza Rima in The Triumph of Light in a brilliant way in English. And I think, who was it? Eliot did some Terza Rima, I think, but there's not very many good examples of Terza Rima in English that works very well. And so I had just seen the play Hamilton. And, I'm not really all that into hip hop, frankly. I like some of it. I like the more political stuff, but I liked Hamilton. I don't care what Ishmael Reed says. I thought it was an interesting experiment. And but I was particularly taken by the rhyming because it suddenly struck me that hip hop gives you this kind of really weird free rhyme.
Yeah.
That isn't that different even from what Dylan's doing in some ways. But, and so I just threw away all the patterns except for I had one rule, which is the last line of each stanza and the first line had to rhyme. So it was a unifying element. And actually, I didn't begin rhyming. Like at first, I was not rhyming all three. I had these little 3-line stanzas. The first and the last and the first line had to rhyme. But at first, I didn't necessarily rhyme the middle line. I would just sort of, create periodic rhymes. And then later, I just evolved into where everything rhymed. but I would have 3 lines rhyming. I'd have 4 lines rhyming. It would just vary as I went through it. But it was a tool. It was a tool.
Yeah.
It was actually a conceptual tool as much as it was an aesthetic one. I mean, part of it was to create a rhythm, but part of it also was, as I was saying before, a mode of discovery. So I think that's what every literary tool turns out to be. I mean, it's a way of engineering the work that you're trying to produce.
That's social engineering. That's it. And what you said really reminded me of Mary Jane Schultz teaching me. She advised Norman Mailer, McLuhan, Bucky Fuller, amazing woman who's been a mentor to me. She said she was intrigued that Eminem writes his lyrics for his rap songs on his hand because he's a fucking POB. He's a print-oriented bastard. It's not, memorizing blah, 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 blah. It's like I'm reading these lines off the half of my hand. Go ahead, Roy.
Well, it's weird because I was just we had a mind melt because I was just thinking of Eminem, and he has some really funny rhymes like what's the difference between us? We can start at the penis, or pick the trees like Sonny Bono. Oh no,
Okay, now guys, we can go on forever and ever, but Duncan's up. He's a professional tetrad guy. The rest of these tetrad questions, we're going to try to zoom in. I don't know if you guys want to go over 2 hours. That's fine with me, but go ahead, Duncan, you're up. And Patrick, you really got it. What does rhyme enhance backbeat rhythm? Okay, Duncan, go ahead.
First of all, I want to say, this is directed mainly to Patrick at this point, reading Joyce's Ulysses in Italian, my experience is the Enrico Terranoni translation is fantastic. The Italian, it's really a wonderful experience. I'm not saying that my Italian, I'm not a good Italian reader, but to listen to the Italian readers reading Terranoni's Italian translation of Ulysses is like world class. I want to say that rhyme enhances biological and geological rhythms and rhymes.
Yeah.
And I'll make one last thing. Part of the deal of going into caves for the olives, just like for the Tibetan monks, is because you hear all those rhythms. Out in the workaday world, we don't hear them so well.
Right.
But actually, I will say I will conject that perhaps part of Sean. What's Sean's name again? Of the
Sean
poem?
McGowan.
Okay. I would say that probably a source of his poetry is when he's in a fucking drunken stupor after a night of drinking and he's lying in bed moaning and groaning from a headache, but he has to stay with his body.
He has to stay with his body. That's brilliant. Yeah. Yeah, because you see it at the end of the movie, he's in a wheelchair, what do you call that stuff splurring out of his lips? And then Bono and everybody's on their knees, the greatest Irish poet of all time. And he's like,
the greatest,
fuck dying. I'm not going to die. I'm going to stay alive. And the whole doc is, don't make a fucking doc about me. It's really beautiful. Anyways, here we go. Roy, what does rhyme render obsolete or displace? Now, again, it's like a car renders obsolete or displaces the horse and buggy, but there's still horse and buggy. So don't worry about time in doing a tetrad. It's just like off the top of your head. What does rhyme render obsolete or displace?
I'm not sure because I think of rhyme being displaced by free verse, like that was a kind of freedom. But the Yeah, on the downside of rhyme, I remember, there was that argument in a portrait where they're arguing who's the better poet, Byron or Tennyson, and Stephen says, yeah, Tennyson, he's just a rhymester,
That's good. What does rhyme render obsolete? Smart ass comments like rhymesters. Okay, Patrick, you're up. What does rhyme render obsolete?
I can't answer. I really have no idea.
That's all right. This is the thing. Saying I don't know is fine. Okay, Lucian.
In the rooms, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. I think what it does render obsolete is that suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
Because in essence, we know with prose, there are moments when we're reading prose that we're simply vanishing into the text. And we're just going through it, and we're in that scene. And it becomes this visceral experience. And I think one of the things that rhyme does do is it says, hey, this is a poem.
Yeah.
So it interrupts that suspension of disbelief, which is actually a term coming from Coleridge, surprisingly. It's a pretty old term. He had the willing suspension of disbelief. That was a Coleridge term.
Wow.
So it interrupts that. And I've actually... because in a sense I have these two rivers of creativity which are flowing to some extent now side by side, but they're also going separate. Most of my current poetry is written without rhyme, and I almost always use rhyme in my lyrics for my songs. And so I think in a sense I have gone away from rhyme in my poetry because I do find it interferes with that suspension of disbelief.
Great.
And I like to get rid of that window pane and just try to go through it. One of my best new poems is called Rilke in Braille. And I describe a blind woman reading a poem of Rilke in Braille translation. And I watch her reading. I'm reading her reading.
Yeah.
And it's important in that poem that I don't rhyme, because I wouldn't want that window to be there between me and the experience and the reader of my poem about reading her reading to have any gates of rhetoric between them.
That's reminds me of Robert Dobbs' line. His book's called Hand Signals for the Blind. Okay, Duncan, you're up. What does rhyme render obsolete?
Overt ending word rhymes renders obsolete in many cases the more intricate intraline rhymes, which we almost don't even notice.
Yeah.
But they are in a lot of excellent poetry, and also what we consider prose. It brings up the question: is James Joyce a poet or a prose writer?
Yeah.
There is a lot of very sophisticated rhyming and word beginnings and word endings in the lines of James Joyce, which don't necessarily have ending word rhymes at all. Same for Flaubert and Mallarmé.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very good, Duncan. Yeah. Joyce was a social engineer a lot of ways. So we got two more questions. We're out of here. These are the Tetrad's third and fourth question. What does it retrieve? And the last one is, what does it flip into and press to an extreme, the reversal? So retrieval is very poetic. So this is the third step of the tetrad that always gets people. What does for example, the car bring back that we previously got rid of? What does it retrieve? And you could say the car retrieves the knight in shining armor. You're covered in metal and you're on a journey. So it's again how McLuhan was calling himself a media theorist in academia, but in essence, he was a poet. And this is very poetic. And this is the question of the tetrad that always stumps people. So we'll go to the brainiac himself, Roy. What does rhyme retrieve? What does it bring back that we got rid of?
Well, I don't know. I was thinking of rhyme, which actually probably has not enough about you, my own train of thought of the axis of selection and the axis of combination. Jacobson talks about that, but that rhyme does really have something to do with the axis of selection, where sometimes you'll select a word just because it rhymes, and then you want to make it mean something.
Yeah.
But it did remind me of a story of Paul Simon talking to Mickey Mantle, and he's saying it's not exactly rhyme, but it's the same idea. He says that you're my all-time favorite baseball player. And goes, well, why did you write that line about Joe DiMaggio then? He goes, well, syllables.
Syllables. Very good. That's good. I like that. Thank you. Okay, Pat, you're up. What does rhyme retrieve?
Retrieve. I thought you were. Oh, well.
Yeah. What does it bring back that we got rid of?
Well, for me, what it brings back is, I'm trying to write a philosophical poem, and I think philosophical poems went out a long time ago. Even though you could argue that all poetry is that way, and rhyme is a way of forcing a certain amount of concreteness into an abstract process, but not only rhyme, but other factors as well. But to me, that what distinguishes a philosophical poem from, an abstract work of philosophy is the introduction of some degree of concreteness, that tries to root the concepts. That's the best I can come up
That's
with.
good. What does it retrieve? Concreteness. Go ahead, Lucian. What does rhyme retrieve?
Well, let's give first a great poem of rhyme, Robert Frost's Fire and Ice.
Mm-hmm.
Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice.
Perfect rhyme. Yeah.
And the rhyming in that poem is so impeccable.
Yeah.
And that's where I jump to as Niels Bohr, the physicist, said, I'm paraphrasing, but the opposite of a superficial truth is a lie, but the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth.
Very good.
Because it does show the window. It does show the poet's hands in the canvas. He's showing off in a way, and yet that poem is fantastic because it's natural.
Yeah.
And even though the rhymes are so perfect, like a crystal, glass or cut diamond, it feels organic. It doesn't feel like he ever strained to rhyme, which is one of the worst crimes of bad poetry, is when it's straining to rhyme, and it's just not organic at all. And Frost famously said, "Poetry is what is lost in translation."
Yeah.
But I think he was talking about a poem like that of his own, because there's no way you could translate that into any other language without losing something vital.
Yeah.
So rhyme retrieves a mastery of language. It retrieves an impeccable mastery of language.
Yeah.
And that's why the great poets, as we still consider them great, like Shakespeare, were masters, absolute masters of rhyme.
Yeah.
As Shakespeare in his sonnets, for thy love remembered, such wealth brings that then I scorn to change my state with kings. It's natural and it's perfect. It just flows out. And we could even say that nature rhymes in the sense that, you look at a leaf and it is a hologram of itself. That's what nature does. And that's what great poets echo.
Lucian, you got it. What does a rhyme retrieve? Nature. But you really went into a lot there, and I really appreciate it, because my favorite Robert Frost was, someone said, could you explain this poem? And he said, you mean you want me to say it worse? and then there's the great joke. You guys know enough of Shakespeare. The hobo bum is in front of a ritzy theater in New York City. And he goes up to the rich theater patron and says, dude, can you spare some change? And the theater patron recites some line from Shakespeare. Blah, 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 blah. But one of you probably know it. And then the rich patron goes, that's Shakespeare. And then the bum goes, fuck you, that's Mammoth. Okay, Duncan, we're almost out of here, gentlemen. This has been amazing. Okay, what does rhyme retrieve, Duncan?
Mother's heartbeat, suckling at the breast, and childhood rhymes and riddles.
In childhood rhymes. Yeah, that's really good. You covered the waterfront there. Okay, we're last step. Pat, you're up first. If you take rhyme and press it to an extreme, what might it flip into? This is the reversal. So we're not saying why we invented rhyme. We're saying we invented rhyme and it has hidden psychic effects. If you press rhyme to an extreme, what might it flip into? Patrick.
Thought.
Yeah, thought. One word. Okay.
Wait, can I just make one little thing before we
of course.
leave?
Yeah.
Earlier, I referred to that poem, Divine Comedies, and I think I attributed it to Charles Wright or somebody, but it was James Merrill. I just want to...
James Merrill. Yeah.
Okay. Merrill, who wrote that.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Very good. Yep. That's all right. That's the cool thing is in Zooms and salons, you can say anything. And if somebody wants to correct you, they put it in the comments. They just say, hey, they misspoke. And that's fine. It's like letters to the editor. Okay, Roy, you're up. If you take rhyme, press it to an extreme, what might it flip into?
I can't do any better than thought.
Thought. It's doubled. Okay, Lucian.
Well, I am actually a huge fan of Muhammad Ali, and actually not just because he's a boxer, but because of his courage, and the fact that my mother met him. She was a school teacher, and he came into the class and he lifted up the little kids and he held them and he just tried to give inspiration to those little kids. And when I talk about courage, I mean, of course, also his giving up his world title belt because of his refusal to go and fight in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And that takes, real courage. That's stepping into the ring of history and knocking out the powers that be. And one of the things that he was famous for were his little poems. I float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And he gave an address at Harvard. And at the end of the address, somebody said, hey, Muhammad, give us a poem. Give us a poem. So he just stopped and he said, me, we. That was his poem. That's the shortest poem probably on the planet. And I want to make a video, or somebody make a video is watching this, have that M of me spin until it ends up the W of we, because it'll be such a beautiful visual.
Mm-hmm.
Lucian, that is so touching, because again, we're all entitled white dudes, and you know, I'm a black wannabe, and I will admit it. Both me and my wife are, and you know, I also think that when it boils down to it, you know, it's everything's colorblind. We want it to be, but you know, my heroes are Muhammad Ali and James Brown. Come on, you can't get better than that. And then, you know, Dylan's pretty good too. And so then you go, who was the biggest influence on Muhammad Ali, James Brown, and Bob Dylan? Gorgeous George, a gay wrestler from the valley, you know, who had a cape. And it's like, wait a minute. Well, I don't know if he was gay, but whatever. You know, he wore his hair like, you know, like
blonde trussels.
Like blonde trussels. But it is amazing. And, you know, that poetry you quoted from Ali is amazing. There's so many great movies on Ali. And my friend just produced the Ken Burns documentary on Ali, and it's amazing. But here's like, just to do that up, like you press rhyme to an extreme with someone else like Muhammad Ali is James Brown. He's got a song called Funky President, and I'm obsessed with it. Go on YouTube and just type in Funky President, and then in parentheses is people, it's bad. And I'm just going to quote one line, you know, a rhyme from it. We've got to get together and buy some land, raise our food just like the man, save our money, do like the mob, put up your fight and own the job. We got to get over before we go under. I mean, to me, that is like as good as Irving Berlin. Come on. Here's the greatest James Brown. I've got a move that tells me what to do. That's amazing. Your move tells you what to do. Okay, we're closing out here. Duncan, what does rhyme flip into when pressed to an extreme? What could it reverse into?
1950s television advertising.
All right.
Very good.
Yeah, forget reciting James Brown and Ali. Let's recite some 50s ad lines.
Listen, tastes good like a cigarette should.
There you go. Nestle's is the very best chocolate.
I always thought a perfect rhyme was a Bain de Soleil for the San Tropez tan. Wow, that's
There you go. Okay, Lucien, you got a 50s ad or any ad you can recite?
Oh God. I mean, the first that comes to mind, because I was growing up in LA, and as a kid, I would hear this advertisement for Pussy Cow, you know, and it said, Pussy cow, pussy cow, pussy cow, pussy cow, pussy cow, pussy cow. And I was just thinking, God, why does he sing? Is he selling used cars? Why does he sing? And I just never knew that he was actually saying, go see cow.
Oh, Cal Worthington. Oh, yeah.
I was mishearing the damn.
You know, I call that hallucinations for the ear. Okay, Duncan, one ad you can recite from your childhood, please.
Winston's taste good like a cigarette should.
Okay, gentlemen, we really degraded. I proved my point to Duncan. Advertising is more important than poetry. But it's really been an honor and a pleasure. I'll let any of you say any closing comments before I say the absolute closing. Anybody have any final benediction moments?
Well, actually, I was glad it was kind of odd you brought out Hendrix, because I was at my friend's house yesterday. It has a great sound system, and I hadn't listened to Axis Bold as Love in a long time, and it was just a great experience.
It's amazing. Truly amazing. Great album cover too.
Yeah. God.
Okay, well, that just shows to go. We have to have a salon on Jimi Hendrix. We got to have future salons on a lot of topics. I'm always welcoming any topic, and even poetry part 2 would be fun with you guys. I sure learned a lot. Anybody else have a closing comment or question?
I'd like to thank Lawrence Ferlinghetti for rescuing me at the age of 16.
Very good. Ferlinghetti, man, he was a bookstore guy from the year I was born, 1953, till he died. I mean, literally going into his bookstore that changed the world. And I walked in there once and talked to him about Marshall McLuhan and Finnegan's Wake. His last book is all about the Wake, by the way. Amazing person. Thank you, Duncan. That's a good kudos to throw out.
Duncan, what do you mean rescued you at 16?
I lived in an oil refinery colony in the Caribbean. And when I was 16, I was introduced to Coney Island of the Mind.
Mhm.
And it was, let's just say, a portal into another world.
Wow, I'd like to invite you, Duncan, to come in and join my Poetry Junkies group. Actually, all of you are welcome. But I was going to say, Duncan, we have a special section of it where we say, this poem changed my life. And it'd be great to hear your story. It'd be marvelous if you'd be open to joining us.
Okay. Well, if it's online, I could possibly do it. But
yeah, it is online. It's online.
Oh, it is online. Okay. All right.
Yeah, and they can go to your website, which is listed in the comments of this salon. They can go to your website, or I can send everybody the email.
Yeah, the best thing for anybody listening as well who's interested, just write me personally an email, lucianzell@yahoo.com, and I will add you to the mailing list for Poetry Junkies. Because I think you're right, Duncan. This is an element of poetry that we forget about, that it is a mating call, that it's a signal of the soul, and it can save people like yourself, Duncan, and it can summon people to a deeper awareness of life itself. And I guess I have 2 closing thoughts. One is that the work that we do on any one poem is the work we do on all poems. And that's why it's so important for me to continue to teach poetry and to dive into poems with fellow poets. And because I really believe that. I believe that concept, that by paying attention to something, energy follows attention, as the yogis say. And so tonight we have engaged in this process of delving into poetry. And the second point is that each true new poem actually redefines what poetry is. And that idea, I think, is so brilliant, because it means that poetry itself is never a completed word. We are constantly expanding the definition of poetry by writing poetry. And that's just a fantastic fact. I mean, it's a fact that basically means that poetry is infinite. And the poetry of this century is one day going to be looked back upon as ancient poetry. We are writing ancient poetry now. It's just not ancient yet.
Yeah, it'll take a little time.
Yeah. And T.S. Eliot, whose poem turned 100 this year, these fragments I've shored against my ruin. I mean, that's what we're trying to do with poetry, I believe, is just shore a few fragments against ruin. That's it. That's all we can possibly hope for.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Well, nice seeing everybody.
Work. Yeah, I
Good.
think Jerry
Nice.
got abscounded by the void. He seems to be gone.
Yeah,
So
he's
we
disappeared.
probably have to let ourselves out.
Yeah.
But
We destroyed him by our
he was sucked into the darkness.
Okay.
Hopefully he will come out the other side.
It's
Anyway, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Greatly
Bye.
appreciate it. Enjoyed everything and look forward to future interactions and poems.
Okay.
All right. I'm gonna let myself out at this point.
blessings.
Blessings to you too. Let's see, what do I do?
Jerry,
Sorry, man. My internet just blew out.
Yes, that's what I pointed
But
out. You were
but you know,
sucked into the void.
I will make a closing comment. I'm sorry I didn't hear the end of yours, Lucian, but I will watch it because it will be on the tape, which will go up as soon as we're done here. That was super weird. I've never had it go out completely and then jump back in so fast. So don't know what happened, but I apologize. And here's my 3 final comments because it goes along with what you were saying, Lucian. Was Robert Graves said, "There's no money in poetry and there's no poetry in money." You know, I found this this experience so enriching to spend these 2 hours with all of you amazing people. And it really evoked McLuhan's line, "Communication of the new is a miracle, but it's not impossible." And back to Robert Graves, he said, "A perfect poem is impossible. Once it had been written, the world would end." So I was going to say, well, now we'll end the Salon.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna go on to other matters in the day. But
And thank you so much to both of you and to Patrick and Rob. I'm going to hit the end button now.
I will
Okay, very
say,
good.
responding to the poetry of Graves' line, the money, I would say poetry is a form of money, and it's a currency that we can use perhaps at the gates of heaven. You know, they'll ask
Beautiful.
for that coin, and it won't be a fucking, dollar. It'll be a coin of poetry.
Yes.
Did it or manifested it. That'll be the currency that gets us through the gates.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
A little known fact that what St. Peter asked is he asked us to recite a poem. And that
That's
is
it.
the deciding factor.
St. Pete will ask us to recite a poem to get in heaven, and no Robert Graves.
Okay, well, I must flee because I must pee.
Later. Bye, Lucy.